Hey everyone, this is a piece by J. Getty titled Trotsky in Exile, the Founding of the Fourth International. The reason that I am reading this piece is I'm trying to get a better feel for what turns the left opposition into the Trotskyist movement, the international left opposition into the Trotskyist movement proper. Which after when it begins to view the Comintern and the CPSU and the National Communist parties no longer as a mainstream, which it seeks to be readmitted to, but decides that it needs to break out onto its own and form its own counter-international. I'm particularly interested in the way that this history relates to Trotsky's analysis of the Russian question. So here we go. And this article is originally from 1986, and it was published in Soviet Studies. There's a follow-up by, there's a response to this piece that I'm also going to read by Thomas Twiss. So here we go. Trotsky in Exile, the Founding of the Fourth International by J. Getty. It looks like it has endnotes as opposed to footnotes, but so here we are. Okay. Leon Trotsky's formal political break with the Bolshevik Party came in 1933 with his decision to renounce allegiance to the Third International, Comintern, and to form a Fourth International. The rupture had not come easily for Trotsky. Although the Bolshevik leadership had expelled Trotsky from the party in 1927 and exiled Trotsky from the Soviet Union in 1929, Trotsky, for Trotsky's part, had never formally split from the party of the Comintern. From the time of his exile to the 1933 break, pro-Trotsky communists, quote, Bolshevik-Leninists, had tried to work both within and outside the official parties of the Comintern in order to influence their policies in a Trotskyist direction, and Trotsky had been reluctant to organize or sanction new Bolshevik-Leninist parties outside the framework of the Comintern. Trotsky had consistently maintained Trotsky's allegiance to the Third International and expressed Trotsky's willingness to defend the Soviet state and the Bolshevik monopoly of power against internal and external class enemies. Trotsky's 4-year loyalty to the party that had exiled him was based in part on Trotsky's fears of the dangers facing the Soviet government. Trotsky defined the Stalinist regime in this period not as a rightist or, quote, Thermidorian counter-revolution, but rather as a centrist political faction which, quote, zigzagged between left and right. Trotsky believed and feared that the zigzagging and incompetence of Stalinist leadership could, however, produce a crisis in which the real political right, parenthesis, kulaks, netmen, whites, or even a man on horseback, and parenthesis, could take advantage of the chaos and mount a genuine counter-revolution. In such circumstances, Trotsky would feel bound to support and defend even the Stalinist centrists from an attack from the right that could topple the Soviet state. Trotsky therefore resisted suggestions that Trotsky adopt the slogan, quote, overthrow Stalin, or organize a new political party which could split the Bolsheviks in a time of crisis. Footnote. The Trotsky Papers, Exile Correspondence, Robert H. McNeil, Trotsky's Interpretations of Stalinism, which is on this channel. That piece is from Robert C. Tucker's book, Stalinism, Essays in Historical Interpretation. It says, the McNeil essay, analyzes Trotsky's changing theoretical evaluation of Stalinism. See also the summary in Isaac Deutscher, The Prophet Outcast, Trotsky 1929 to 1940, pages 172 to 175. End footnote. When studying political actors and theorists, it is always difficult to separate the subjective from the objective. Does a politician adopt a particular policy or stance as a result of subjective personal motivations or objective analysis? Treatments of most Bolshevik and especially Stalinist politicians have routinely stressed personal ambition as a determinant of political or theoretical pronouncements. But few of the hagiographical and scholarly works on Trotsky have questioned Trotsky's intellectual integrity or asked critical questions about the personal motives behind Trotsky's theoretical and political positions. Since Isaac Deutscher's pioneering biography, Trotsky has been, quote, the prophet outcast, end quote, a tragic hero whose personal and political life was shaped, often disastrously, by Trotsky's objective theoretical views more than vice versa. Footnote. Most writers on Trotsky and Exile have concentrated on Trotsky's writings rather than Trotsky's political activities. See Alec Nova, a note on Trotsky and the, quote, left opposition 1929 to 1931, which will be on this channel. Richard B. Day and the Problems of the Smitchka and Forced Collectivization. I think I have that downloaded, but I don't think I've read it. Warren Lerner, The Caged Lion, Trotsky's Writings in Exile, published in Studies in Comparative Communism, 1977. Samuel Cassels, Trotsky and the Bulletin of the Opposition, also published in Studies in Comparative Communism. Siegfried Bonner, Trotsky on Stalin's Russia, published in Survey in 1962. Exceptions include Jean van Huysenoort with Trotsky in Exile, From Pinky Po to Coyoacán, published in 1978, and Deutscher, the Prophet Outcast. End footnote. In particular, Trotsky's 1933 decision to form the Fourth International has been explained as a function of an objective economic, social, and political analysis of the situations in the Comintern and the USSR. Yet Trotsky's private writings and activities suggest that Trotsky's changing theoretical evaluations of the USSR and the Bolshevik Party resulted at least in part from the vicissitudes of his tactical position and partisan hopes and not vice versa. Trotsky was a politician as well as a political analyst, and one should not be surprised to discover that Trotsky's private political activities continued in exile or, as with most politicians, influenced Trotsky's public theoretical pronouncements. Formation of separate political organizations and renunciation of allegiance to the Comintern would have made Trotsky and Trotsky's followers members of a separate anti-Bolshevik political party and would have placed Trotsky and Trotsky's partisans completely outside the pale of Bolshevik politics. Such a stance would doom any chance for Trotsky to return to the Moscow party leadership. With hindsight, for Trotsky to have harbored such a hope seems naive and quixotic, but the uncertainties of the dynamic political and social crisis of 1929 to 32 made many things seem possible. Indeed, Trotsky believed in and hoped for the possibility of a return to the Moscow leadership and worked tirelessly for a return to the Moscow leadership. The collapse of Trotsky's last hope for a recall to Moscow coincided with Trotsky's decision to form the Fourth International. Using Trotsky's public writings of the 1930s, most writers have agreed that Hitler's crushing the Communist Party of Germany, KPD, and the workers' movement in February-March 1933 led Trotsky finally to question Trotsky's allegiance first to the KPD and then to the Comintern and the Comintern's member parties. Footnote. See Deutscher, the Prophet Outcast. See some article by Michel Dreyfus. See an article by Jean van Huysenoort, How the Fourth International was Conceived, published in Joseph Hanson's edited volume, Leon Trotsky, The Man and His Work, and George Brightman and Bev Scott's edited volume, Writings of Trotsky, 1933 to 1934. End footnote. Trotsky was angry with the KPD and the KPD's Comintern masters for not forming a, quote, united front from above and below, end quote, with the German socialists, parenthesis, SPD, and parenthesis, to block Hitler's victory. In March, Trotsky wrote a series of articles in which Trotsky called for the formation of a wholly new German Communist Party rather than the resuscitation of the KPD. Writing under the pseudonym G. Gurov, Trotsky suggested that the decision had been taken reluctantly. Quote, just as a doctor does not leave a patient who still has a breath of life, he had for our task the reform of the party, as long as there... He had for our task the reform of the party... I fucked this whole quote up. Quote, just as a doctor does not leave a patient who still has a breath of life, we had for our task the reform of the party as long as there was the least hope. But it would be criminal to tie oneself to a corpse, end quote. Trotsky. Although Trotsky now sanctioned the formation of a new non-Comintern party in Germany, Trotsky stopped short of renouncing loyalty to the Third International or Soviet Communist Party and refused to approve the creation of new communist parties anywhere except Germany. In reply to a rhetorical question about giving up on the Comintern as a whole, quote, G. Gurov waffled, quote, in my opinion, it would be incorrect to give a rigid answer, ... end quote. He then suggested that the German disaster could serve as an object lesson that could shock other communist parties into reforming Comintern policy. Quote, the question has not been settled for the USSR, where proclamation of the slogan of the second party would be incorrect, ... It's not a question of the creation of the Fourth International, but of salvaging the third. End quote. Trotsky. It's from the article KPD or New Party. Again, on the 9th of April 1933, Trotsky maintained that, quote, we do not break with the Third International. In response to, end quote. In response to a question on whether it was not inconsistent to break with the Comintern in Germany and not elsewhere, Trotsky minimized the issue as a matter of, quote, bookkeeping. Quote, if, however, the Stalinist bureaucracy should bring the USSR to ruin, ... it will be necessary to build a Fourth International. End quote. Trotsky. For 4 months following his call for a new German Communist Party, Trotsky declined to extend his renunciation of the KPD to the Soviet or other communist parties. It was not until mid-July that Trotsky finally announced that one cannot remain, quote, captive to one's own formula, end quote, and that hope for Comintern reform was dead. In an article entitled, It is Necessary to Build Communist Parties and an International Anew, Trotsky wrote that the Soviet Communist Party was no longer a party at all, but merely, quote, an apparatus of domination in the hands of an uncontrolled bureaucracy, end quote. There was, therefore, no party with which to break. "5 days later, Trotsky wrote that the, quote, Bolshevik Party no longer exists, end quote, and that accordingly it was time to, quote, abandon the slogan of the reform of the CPSU, end quote. Trotsky, July 1933. Apprehensive that Trotsky would now be widely regarded as an anti-Soviet counter-revolutionary, Trotsky still refused to call for a revolution in the Soviet Union. In Trotsky's view, Soviet Russia was still a workers' state that, quote, can be regenerated, ... without a revolution, end quote. Trotsky, July 1933. It was not until the 1st of October 1933 that Trotsky asserted, quote, no normal, quote, constitutional, end quote, ways remain to remove the ruling clique. The bureaucracy can be compelled to yield power into the hands of the proletariat only by force, end quote. The bureaucracy can be compelled to yield power into the hands of the proletariat only by force, end quote. Still queasy about the implications of this position, Trotsky argued that such force would not be, quote, an armed insurrection against the dictatorship of the proletariat, but the removal of a malignant growth upon it, end quote. Trotsky. Trotsky was advocating not, quote, measures of civil war, but rather the measures of a police character, end quote. Trotsky. July 1933. Should be October 1933, excuse me. Footnote. In the Moscow purge trials of 1936 to 38, prosecutor Vyshinsky would quote from this article as evidence that Trotsky advocated the violent overthrow of the Soviet government. End footnote. Trotsky's October call for the use of force against the Soviet Party regime was not qualitatively new. Trotsky was only dotting the, quote, I's and crossing the, quote, T's of Trotsky's key July statements renouncing the Bolshevik Party and denying its existence. Footnote. The editors of the writings of Leon Trotsky see the 1st of October article as a qualitative evolution in Trotsky's thinking. Jean van Huysgenort, however, correctly notes that the, quote, perspective of reform was definitely abandoned, end quote, in July. See van Huysgenort's How the Fourth International was Conceived. End footnote. If reform were impossible and if the Stalinist clique refused to abdicate power, then the July position already implied removing it by force. Trotsky's July renunciation of the Comintern and Bolshevik Party, and Trotsky's simultaneous call for a new international comprised the chief watershed in the political activities of Trotsky's exile. Why, after the mid-March articles on Germany, did it take Trotsky 4 months to follow the clear logic of his position and break with the Comintern? Trotsky's admiring biographer Isaac Deutscher found the delay, quote, illogical, but explained simply that, quote, the logic of his new venture soon got the better of Trotsky, end quote, in the months that followed. Deutscher attributed Trotsky's peculiar hesitation on the matter to Trotsky's long-time loyalty to the Comintern and Trotsky's fear of Russian counter-revolution. While these factors were pertinent to the 1929 to 32 period, an explanation based on them does not fully account for the illogical 4-month pause between breaking with the KPD and renouncing the KPD's Moscow Comintern policymakers. Did either rightist danger or Trotsky's loyalty to the Comintern decrease so dramatically after the March KPD disaster? Trotsky himself anticipated questions about the delay. Trotsky had written in April that a Fourth International would not be necessary unless the Stalinist clique brought the USSR to ruin. Since Trotsky never claimed that any action on Stalin's part between March and July brought the USSR any closer to ruin than it already was, both the delay and the proposal of a Fourth International needed explaining. Indeed, on the 27th of July 1933, Trotsky admitted that logically the Comintern break should have come in April. First, Trotsky explained that disagreement between himself and his, quote, German comrades on the question of a new party had caused friction in the, quote, left opposition and delayed the total break. Trotsky had to convince his German followers of the necessity for a break. Second, Trotsky claimed that between March and July, Trotsky had been waiting to see if the parties or leadership of the Comintern would, quote, wake up and abruptly change their policies. Footnote. See 4 New Communist Parties in the New International, published by Trotsky on the 27th of July, 1933. And footnote. It's hard to weigh the importance of either of these factors for Trotsky's unusual indecisiveness. It is true that the German Trotskyists with whom Trotsky corresponded resisted the notion of a new party, although Trotsky had not taken them seriously enough to consult with them beforehand and had never shown much reluctance to break with the small European leftist groups which defied him. Footnote. See the article, The German Decision Against a New Party in the Writings of Leon Trotsky, Supplement, 1929 to 1933. And the article, We Must Have a Decision on Germany, published 1933. The other explanation, and footnote, the other explanation that Trotsky awaited 4 months for the Comintern quickly to admit the error of its ways is even less convincing. No one had less reason than Trotsky to be optimistic about the Comintern, and no one had so relentlessly documented the Comintern's failure over the preceding decade. Trotsky could not have been so naive or ignorant of Comintern politics as to expect either a mea culpa from the Comintern Executive Committee or an independent, defiant policy from the member parties. It seems, therefore, that the lack of Comintern reform cannot explain the timing of the call for a Fourth International. Yet Trotsky's typically polemical, assertive, and self-justifying writings have led scholars to accept Trotsky's version of the Fourth International decision and ask few questions about Trotsky's procrastination. The issue is of more than simple antiquarian or psychological interest, since both published and archival documents suggest another side to Trotsky's life in the 1930s, quite apart from Trotsky's journalistic and editorial activities. Behind the scenes of his public reflections on the Comintern, Trotsky was trying both to organize illegal opposition groups in the USSR and to negotiate with Moscow for his illegal return. To negotiate with Moscow for his legal return. Long before the 1933 disaster in Germany, Trotsky had tried to maintain contact with followers in the USSR. Since 1929, Trotsky had corresponded with those of his adherents who were in internal exile in Siberia or Central Asia. Footnote: Sadov's address book contained the exile addresses of Trotskyists in the USSR. The exile correspondence section of the Trotsky Papers, the archive, contains copies of such letters. And footnote. Trotsky had tried to smuggle copies of the Bulletin Oppositie, the opposition bulletin, into the Soviet Union, and through his son Lev Sadov, who lived in Berlin, had maintained contacts with tourist and Soviet officials traveling to and from the USSR. As it became clear that his letters to the Soviet Union were being screened and intercepted by the secret police, he switched to postcards, since he believed that they were scrutinized less carefully. At the time of the Moscow show trials, Trotsky denied that he had any communication with defendants since his exile in 1929. Footnote. See Trotsky's account of these difficult communications in the Dewey Commission, The Case of Leon Trotsky, published in 1937. This volume is the transcript of the 1937 Commission of Inquiry chaired by John Dewey, which investigated the charges made against Trotsky at the 1933-37 Moscow show trials. Trotsky participated willingly in the inquiry. End footnote. At the time of the Moscow show trials, Trotsky denied that he had any communication with defendants since his exile in 1929. Yet it is now clear that in 1932, Trotsky sent secret personal letters to former leading oppositionists Karl Radek, G. Sokolnikov, Evgeny Preobrazhensky, and others. While the contents of these letters are unknown, it seems reasonable to believe that they involved an attempt to persuade the addressees to return to opposition. Footnote. Unlike virtually all Trotsky's other letters, including even the most sensitive, no copies of these remain in the Trotsky Papers. It seems likely that they have been removed from the papers at some time. Only the certified mail receipts remain. At his 1937 trial, Karl Radek testified that he had received a letter from Trotsky containing, quote, terrorist instructions, but we do not know whether this was the letter in question. End footnote. We know considerably more, however, about another clandestine communication between Trotsky and supporters in the USSR late in 1932. Sometime in October, E.S. Goltzman, a former Trotskyist and current Soviet official, met Sadov in Berlin and gave him a proposal from veteran Trotskyist Ivan Smirnov and other left oppositionists in the USSR for the formation of a united opposition bloc. The proposed bloc was to include Trotskyists, Zinovievists, members of the Lamenadze group, and others. Sadov wrote to Trotsky relaying the proposal, and Trotsky approved. Quote, the proposition of the bloc seems to me completely acceptable, end quote. Trotsky wrote. Quote, but it is a question of bloc, not merger, end quote. Quote, how will the bloc manifest itself? For the moment, principally through reciprocal information. Our allies will keep us up to date on that which concerns the Soviet Union, and we will do the same thing on that which concerns the Comintern, end quote. Trotsky. In Trotsky's view, the bloc should exclude those who capitulated and recanted. Capitulation as sentiment, quote, will be inexorably and pitilessly combated by us, end quote. Trotsky. Footnote. Trotsky was always bitterly opposed to those who capitulated to Stalin or recanted their opposition. He wrote such persons off completely. I'm curious if that's actually true, because I think all those people that he just mentioned, like for instance Karl Radek and Preobrazhensky, did capitulate to Stalin, including like probably the person who held out the longest, which is Christian Rakovsky. He eventually capitulated. End footnote. Goldsman had relayed the opinion of those in the Soviet Union that participation in the bloc by the right opposition was desirable, and that formation of the bloc should be delayed until their participation could be secured. Trotsky reacted against this suggestion, quote, the Allies, end quote, opinion that one must wait until the rights can easily... Fuck that up. Quote, the Allies' opinion that one must wait until the rights can easily join does not have my approval, ... end quote. Trotsky. Trotsky was impatient with what Trotsky considered passivity on the part of the right opposition. Quote, one struggles against repression by anonymity and conspiracy, not by silence, end quote. Trotsky, in the Trotsky Papers. Footnote. Alec Nova has shown that while there were some differences, Trotsky's critique of Stalin's industrialization and collectivization plans resembled that of Bukharin and the right. Indeed, Trotsky's spirited defense of the Smichka and rural market relations, Trotsky's criticism of the ultra-leftist campaign against the kulaks, and Trotsky's advocacy of planning on the basis of, quote, real potentials, were similar to the strictures of Bukharin's Notes of an Economist. Parenthesis, for another view which sees continuity in Trotsky's critique from the 1920s to the 1930s, see Richard B. Day's article, Trotsky on the Problems of the Smichka, end quote. In the light of the apparent similarities between his and Bukharin's critiques, Trotsky was anxious to maintain the separate identity of the left opposition. Trotsky wrote in 1932 that although, quote, practical disagreements with the right will hardly be revealed, ... it is intolerable to mix up the ranks and blunt the distinctions, end quote. Trotsky. That's from the writings of Leon Trotsky, supplement 1929 to 33. In a secret letter to his son about the 1932 bloc, Trotsky warned Sadov not to, quote, leave the field to the rights, end quote. Despite Trotsky's efforts, Moscow hardliners were able to portray Trotsky as a scheming, quote, unprincipled, end quote, oppositionist, and to denounce, quote, left-right, end quote, conspirators at the Moscow show trials. End footnote. Sadov then replied that the bloc had been organized, quote, it embraces the Zinovievists, the Sten-Lamanadze group, and the Trotskyists. Parenthesis, old, quote, blank, end quote, end parenthesis, end quote. The, quote, the Safarov-Tarkanov group has not yet formally entered. The Safarov-Tarkanov group have a very extreme position. They will enter soon, end quote. Sadov. Footnote. Shortly thereafter, Trotsky wrote cryptically that, quote, as far as the illegal organization of the Bolshevik Leninists is concerned, only the first steps have been taken towards its reorganization, end quote. End footnote. Ironically, back in the Soviet Union, the leaders of the bloc were being rounded up by the police at this precise moment. Ivan Smirnov and those around him, including the economist Preobrazhensky, had been arrested, quote, by accident. It seems that a provocateur in their midst had denounced them on a separate matter. Moreover, Zinoviev and Kamenev had been arrested and deported for knowing about the oppositional Ryutin platform and not reporting the oppositional Ryutin platform to the authorities. Although these events certainly disrupted the bloc, Sadov was not despondent. Sadov was sure that the police had found no documents or, quote, Trotskyist literature on Smirnov, and while, quote, the arrest of the, quote, ancients is a great blow, the lower workers are safe, end quote. At about this time, Trotsky attempted to contact his, quote, lower workers directly. During a brief stay in Copenhagen, Trotsky handed a letter to an English supporter named Harry Wicks, who was to convey it to oppositionists in Russia. The letter began, quote, I am not sure that you know my handwriting. If not, you will probably find someone else who does, end quote. Trotsky went on to call upon loyal oppositionists to become active, quote, the comrades who sympathize with the left opposition are obliged to come out of their passive state at this time, maintaining, of course, all precautions, end quote. Trotsky went on to give names and addresses of safe contacts in Berlin, Prague, and Istanbul to whom communications for Trotsky could be sent, and then concluded, quote, I am certain that the menacing situation in which the party finds itself will force all the comrades devoted to the revolution to gather actively about the left opposition, end quote. Trotsky. Footnote. Quoted by permission of the Houghton Library. See also The Case of Leon Trotsky. The editors of the writings of Leon Trotsky claim that the letter was intended to help Harry Wicks' credibility among Russian Trotskyists in London. See Writings of Leon Trotsky, 1932. But the archival copy contains a notation which shows that the letter's intended destination was the USSR. End footnote. It is clear, then, that a united left oppositional bloc was formed in 1932. In Trotsky's opinion, the bloc existed only for the purposes of communication and exchange of information, and from the evidence, it seems clear that Trotsky envisioned no secret, quote, terrorist role for the bloc, as Moscow would charge 4 years later. There is also reason to believe that after the decapitation of the bloc, through the removal of Zinoviev, Kamenev, Smirnov, and others, the organization included mainly lower-level, less prominent oppositionists, followers of Zinoviev, but not Zinoviev himself. Finally, it seems that Trotsky attempted to maintain direct contact with the, quote, allies. The size and strength of the 1932 bloc cannot be determined, and one does not know how threatening it was to the regime. In any case, events would show that both Trotskyists and Stalinists took it seriously. Aside from the bloc, Trotsky was pursuing another strategy in these months. During the autumn of 1932, Trotsky had written to his son Zadov that it would be strategically important to offer to, quote, cooperate with the regime in power, end quote, in order not to alienate potential supporters within the Stalin apparatus. In March 1933, Trotsky made a final step to, quote, cooperate with Moscow by magnanimously offering to return to the Moscow leadership. Three days after Trotsky's G. Gurov article, and it's like, what, his pseudonym? You said that earlier, right? Three days after his G. Gurov article breaking with the KPD, Trotsky made his formal offer to return to the Politburo leadership under certain conditions. Trotsky made his proposition in a remarkable secret letter sent to the Politburo on the 15th of March. 1933. Trotsky's letter was based on his perception that economic catastrophe was overwhelming the party leadership, which now needed the support and participation of all factions in order to rebuild the party and maintain power. Quote, I consider it my duty to make one more attempt to appeal to the sense of responsibility of those who presently lead the Soviet state. You know conditions better than I. If the internal development of the country proceeds further on its present course, catastrophe is inevitable. End quote. Trotsky. Trotsky referred the Politburo to his recent articles in the opposition bulletin for his analysis. Trotsky cited Hitler's recent victory in Germany as evidence of the bankruptcy of Comintern policy and asserted that disasters like that had led to a, quote, loss of confidence in the leadership, end quote. One second. Oh, sorry, never mind. What was needed was a, quote, rebirth of the party organization, end quote, in order to reestablish confidence, and the left opposition was willing to cooperate. Some of you will say, Trotsky mused, that the left opposition merely wants a path to power and is offering... Sorry. Some of you will say, Trotsky mused, that the left opposition merely wants a path to power and is offering to cooperate only to get back inside the leadership. However, the question, Trotsky replied, is not power, bracket, exclamation point, and bracket. Is there supposed to be quotes here? It seems like there's supposed to be quotes here. However, the question, Trotsky replied, is not power, bracket, exclamation point, and bracket, for this or that faction, but rather the survival of the worker state and international revolution for many years. Quote, only open and honest cooperation between the historically produced fractions, fully transforming them into tendencies in the party, and eventually dissolving into it, can, in concrete conditions, restore confidence in the leadership and resurrect the party, end quote. Trotsky then promised that a returning left opposition would not persecute any party members who had opposed the left opposition in the past. After describing the conditions which demanded the return of the opposition, Trotsky made a remarkable offer. Alluding to the platform of the left opposition, Trotsky insisted, quote, renunciation of this program is of course out of the question, ... But concerning the manner of presenting and defending this program before the Central Committee and the party, not to mention the manner of putting it into effect, there can and must be achieved a preliminary agreement with the goal of preventing shocks or splitting, end quote. Trotsky. Footnote, hardliners in the Moscow leadership must have noted and argued that Trotsky's proposal that his, quote, fraction, end quote, retain its distinctive program after readmission to the party ran counter to Lenin's famous 1921 ban on factions and factional platforms. Quote, on party unity adopted the 10th Congress in 1921. End footnote. Trotsky thus proposed that the left opposition be allowed to return to the leadership as, quote, a tendency, end quote, within the party, and insisted that Trotsky's group would not publicly renounce its critique and program. Trotsky was, however, leaving the door open for a deal under which agitation for his program could be held in abeyance for an indefinite period. Trotsky was willing to re-enter the leadership without the usual recantation, but with the suggestion that for the sake of party unity, Trotsky would refrain from criticism. This was a new proposal. Previously, Trotsky had demanded unlimited freedom of criticism for the opposition within the party, but now Trotsky was making oppositional criticism conditional on an, quote, agreement to be worked out. The contradiction with Trotsky's previous conditions and demands explains the secrecy of the letter. Footnote, without revealing his offer to Moscow, Trotsky wrote that, quote, mutual criticism, may have a different character depending on the extent to which it is consciously prepared by both sides and in what organizational framework it takes place, end quote. That's dated 30th of March, 1933. These cryptic remarks may have been published in order to prepare his followers for Moscow's possible acceptance of Trotsky's proposal to make criticism by the opposition conditional and restricted. End footnote. Unlike Trotsky's previous open letters to the Soviet leadership, this epistle was never released or published by Trotsky. Footnote. For an example of the more common open letter, see Trotsky Papers T3423. End footnote. Trotsky concluded the letter by informing the Politburo that the Politburo were receiving the only copy of the document. This would leave the Politburo, quote, free to choose the means, end quote, to begin discussions. On the 12th of March article, KPD or New Party, and the 15th of March secret letter were interrelated. First, Trotsky may have thought that his call for a new party in Germany would put pressure on the Moscow leadership, which would conceivably opt to take Trotsky back rather than face a split in the Comintern. Second, the secret letter to the Politburo also helps to explain why Trotsky wrote the 12th of March article under a pseudonym. Pending a reply to his 15th of March offer, Trotsky was not yet committed to the Fourth International, and the pseudonym would allow him later to deny that he had broken with Comintern politics. I fucked that up. Let me reread that, I'm sorry. First, Trotsky may have thought that his call for a new party in Germany would put pressure on the Moscow leadership, which would conceivably opt to take Trotsky back rather than face a split in the Comintern. Second, the secret letter to the Politburo also helps to explain why Trotsky wrote the 12th of March article under a pseudonym. Pending a reply to Trotsky's 15th of March offer, Trotsky was not yet committed to the Fourth International, and the pseudonym would allow Trotsky later to deny that Trotsky had broken with the Comintern parties. Such, quote, deniability, end quote, would have been important to Trotsky if Moscow had responded favorably to Trotsky's offer to return. In such a case, Trotsky's restored position in the Moscow leadership would have been inconsistent with a call to break with the KPD, and it would have been necessary to disavow G. Gurov. Trotsky's delays in breaking with the other parties of the Comintern, including the Bolsheviks, can thus be partially explained. After March, Trotsky was waiting for Moscow to answer his secret letter before committing himself publicly to a Fourth International. As much as waiting for the Comintern to admit its mistakes and reform itself, Trotsky delayed his break with Moscow in order to keep his personal options open. A month and a half later, Trotsky despaired of receiving a reply from the Politburo. On the 10th of May, 1933, Trotsky sent the Politburo an angry coda to the March letter, which Trotsky entitled Explanation. Footnote. On the last page of the July issue of the Opposition Bulletin, Trotsky referred vaguely to the 15th of March letter to the Politburo. While mentioning neither his offer to defer the opposition program nor his May, quote, explanation, Trotsky claims somewhat inaccurate that the March letter simply repeated his long-standing offer to return to the Bolshevik Party, quote, under conditions guaranteeing us the right to defend our views, end quote. End footnote. The short statement began by noting that the Politburo had only replied to Trotsky with silence. Trotsky stressed again the danger facing the Bolshevik regime, and pointedly warned that the regime could fall because of the mistakes committed by the Stalin faction. Trotsky then ominously served notice on the Politburo that he now felt free to agitate among the lower ranks of the Stalinist bureaucracy. Quote, we are sending this document, bracket, the March letter plus the May explanation, end bracket, to responsible workers in the belief that among the blind, the careerists, and the cowards, There are honest revolutionaries from whose eyes one cannot hide the real state of things. ... We call upon these honest revolutionaries to make contact with us. Seek and ye shall find. End quote. Trotsky. The 10th of May explanation marked the end of Trotsky's attempts to return, quote, legally to the Moscow leadership. The disaster in Germany, the clumsy economic policy of the apparatus, and finally Stalin's refusal to negotiate with Trotsky convinced Trotsky that any kind of cooperation with the Stalinist faction was impossible. But Trotsky's 15th of July article Trotsky's 15th of July 1933 article, "It is necessary to build communist parties and an international anew," was still 2 months in the future. Why did Trotsky further delay his total break with the Bolsheviks and the Comintern? While simple indecision was certainly part of the answer, it may well have been that Trotsky felt that the 1932 bloc still offered possibilities, short of a total break with the Comintern. As we have seen, Zinoviev and Kamenev had been expelled from the party and exiled in October 1932 for their knowledge of the Ryutin platform. In an article on their expulsion dated the 19th of October 1932, Trotsky had taken a generally soft, sympathetic, and conciliatory attitude toward the two leaders. They were, after all, still members of the ephemeral bloc. Their expulsion from the party and their lack of recantation still put them in Trotsky's camp, as Trotsky saw it. Any hopes that Trotsky entertained about the viability of the bloc were shattered in May 1933. Fewer than 10 days after Trotsky appended his May, quote, explanation to the secret letter, Trotsky learned that Zinoviev and Kamenev had capitulated to Stalin, recanted their sins, and repledged their loyalty to the Stalinist faction. Zinoviev and Kamenev's departure from opposition embittered Trotsky. In a 23rd of May article, Trotsky described the Zinoviev and Kamenev as pitiful, tragic, and subservient. On the 6th of July 1933, Trotsky railed against Zinoviev and Kamenev once again and denounced Zinoviev and Kamenev's capitulation in strong terms. Footnote: Zinoviev on the party regime in the writings of Leon Trotsky, 1932 to 1933, dated 6th of July 1933. End footnote. The leaders, if not the lower workers of the bloc, were gone. Both of Trotsky's non-public strategies were now in ruins. The Politburo had ignored his offer to return, and the recantations of Zinoviev and Kamenev had decapitated the 1932 bloc. The options which Trotsky had sought to keep open were now closed, and Trotsky could no longer hope for a return to Moscow in the near future. 9 days after his bitter article against Zinoviev, he penned the fateful 15th of July article breaking with the mainstream communist parties and the Comintern. There was no longer any point in remaining, quote, captive to one's own formula, end quote. The party which 1 month before Trotsky had sought to rejoin, quote, no longer exists, end quote, and was now incapable of reform. It is almost as if Trotsky equated reform of the party with Trotsky's return to it. I think that's pretty true. There was more to Trotsky's life in exile than theorizing and publishing. Taking the formation of the Fourth International as a case study, one can see that Trotsky's partisan activities affected the nature and timing of Trotsky's theoretical assertions. Indeed, the failure of Trotsky's secret political strategies was a major component in Trotsky's decision to break with the Comintern and to go it alone. Trotsky's conspiratorial machinations were not the only factors in the decision, but they were important and perhaps better account for the 4-month delay in breaking with Moscow than do his public explanations. It seems reasonable to suppose further that Trotsky's activities were grist to the mill of those hard-line Moscow politicians who favored repression of the opposition. Trotsky's activities could not but have provided political ammunition for those in the Kremlin who demanded stern measures. Trotsky's secret letters to followers in the Soviet Union, Trotsky's organization of the 1932 bloc, Trotsky's formation of the Fourth International, Trotsky's call for the overthrow of the party leadership by force, and Trotsky's continued opposition to Comintern policies, particularly to the Popular Front, later made it easy for hardliners to portray Trotsky as a devious and, quote, unprincipled plotter who was scheming to return, forming conspiracies, and opposing communist parties both politically and organizationally. In looking back over Soviet history since 1933, Trotsky's activities and writings might at first seem pointless and irrelevant. Indeed, there was considerable pathos in his actions and writings. After years in exile, Trotsky still wrote as if Trotsky were part of the leadership. In criticizing the first five-year plan, he often used the first person, quote, ... we have not entered socialism. We have far from attained mastery of the methods of planned regulation. We are fulfilling only the first rough hypotheses, fulfilling them poorly, and with our headlights not yet on, end quote. Trotsky, October 1932. With hindsight, Trotsky's attempt to organize secret blocks and Trotsky's offers to return to Moscow seems sad. Following Deutscher and others, Alec Nova observed, quote, how few were his followers, how politically ineffective, any meaningless, were his eloquent if sometimes dogmatic words, end quote. But hindsight can be misleading. Bolshevik Party history showed how quickly political fortunes could change. At the end of 1916, Lenin and his circle of expatriates must certainly have seemed dubious candidates to rule the Russian Empire, but war, social conflict, and political paralysis quickly changed the situation. Some people call this Simmerwald syndrome. The idea that the conditions are going to so radically change, and that you can bank on that in some capacity, and it'll provide miraculous new opportunities, and suddenly your sect or your little or your group of seemingly of powerless activists will suddenly have tremendous powers and responsibilities in the near future. Some people call that Simmerwald syndrome. Anyway, the social and political upheavals of the 1930s, combined with the fascist threat of war, offered the possibility of a similarly fluid and dynamic situation. Stalin's removal and Trotsky's return did not seem so far-fetched to either of them. It seems that the Stalinists took the possibility quite seriously and never relaxed their pressure on Trotsky and Trotskyism. The Stalinist press constantly vilified Trotskyism as the, quote, vanguard of counter-revolution, end quote. Trotsky's mail to the USSR was intercepted and his entourage was infiltrated by Stalinist agents. Footnote, Van Huysenoort, with Trotsky in Exile, in the book With Trotsky in Exile, maintains that Sadov's close assistant, Mark Zabrovsky, alias Etienne, was a Stalinist agent. NKV defector Alexander Orlov, in testimony before a U.S. Senate hearing, also denounced Zabrovsky and provided detailed information. See U.S. Senate Subcommittee to investigate the administration of the Internal Security Act. Testimony of Alexander Orlov, Washington, D.C., 1962. The Trotsky Papers 15765 is a file on suspected Stalinist agents in Trotsky's entourage. End footnote. Secret police official Yakov Blyumkin was shot simply for meeting Trotsky abroad. And it says Yakov Blumkin lived from 1900 to 1929 and was a left socialist revolutionary, a Bolshevik, and an agent of the Cheka and the Joint State Political Directorate, OGPU. Footnote. See Rex Winsbury, Jacob Blumkin in Russia, 1892 to 1929, published in History Today. as well as Deutscher, the Prophet Outcast, pages 84 to 88. End footnote. Later in 1936, the 1932 bloc became the evidential base for the Moscow show trials and the massacre of Trotskyists in the Azov terror, which accompanied them. Footnote. See J.R.H. Getty, Origins of the Great Purges, the Soviet Communist Party Reconsidered, 1933 to 1938. Chapter 5 for a discussion of how the 1932 bloc might have influenced Soviet Party politics in 1936. End footnote. In the Spanish Civil War, hard-pressed Spanish and Russian communists took the trouble to round up and shoot Trotskyists. The Soviet government put continuous pressure on the governments of Norway, Belgium, France, and Mexico in an attempt to deny Trotsky an exile sanctuary or base of operations. Finally, in 1940, with war on the horizon, Trotsky was assassinated in Mexico. Stalin thus made sure that history would not repeat itself. In whatever crisis that might follow, there would be no brilliant exiled revolutionary personality to return home in a sealed train as Lenin had done in 1917. That's the end of the piece. Thanks for listening. Listen to, also, I haven't read it yet, but there's also going to be a piece that I'm about to read now by Thomas Twist, which is a response to this article. Thanks for listening.